Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, The Drive Toward Healthier Buildings. I'm Kim Melton, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. And joining me today are Donna Laquidara-Carr from Dodge Data and Analytics and Diana Fisler from Johns Manville. After brief introductions, we'll go over a few logistics and then dive into the presentation. So, Donna, if you could go ahead and please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hello, yes, my name is Donna Laquidara-Carr, as she mentioned. I am with Dodge Data and Analytics. I'm the Research Director of Industry Insights there, and if you could go to the next slide. And I wanted to give you a little bit of information about who we are so that you know where I'm sitting. Hopefully most people on the call have heard of Dodge Data and Analytics. We are North America's leading provider of analytics and software-based workflow integration solutions for the construction industry. As you can see, our company has three major divisions. Probably the one most people are familiar with is our Dodge Global Network, which is our comprehensive database of projects and players in the industry. We also have our suites.com, which is a leading source about building products. But where I sit is the Dodge Analytics part of the company, and we do a lot of different things. The forecasts that you hear coming out of Dodge come from here, but we also do some custom analytics. And what I work on specifically is listed at the bottom of the slide, the SmartMarket reports. We do research on transformative trends in the construction industry. And they include things such as sustainability, like the health discussion we're going to have, to technology. And I just want to make sure everyone's aware that if you find you're interested in what we're going to be talking about today, the report is available for free download at that website listed there, analyticsstore.construction.com. Next slide. Diana, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Donna. And I'm Diana Fisler. I'm a Ph.D. and Lead Green Associate with Johns Manville in the role of Building Science and Innovation Leader. Next slide. At Johns Manville, we live the JM experience, which incorporates 4 pillars: people, passion, perform, and protect. These webinars are an example of how we share those pillars with customers and market influencers. We hope this webinar will provide an educational tool for you and your company. If at the end of this presentation you have any comments or suggestions on how we can better accomplish these goals, we would ask you to please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar so we can improve and better provide the JM experience to you. Next slide. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. You can submit your questions through the question box you should see at the right top side of your screen. My colleague Kim Melton will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we'll address them at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Donna?
All right, thank you, Diana. So I want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at what a healthier building is, why owners care about them, and what they're interested in when it comes to healthier buildings, what's going to drive the industry to focus more on healthier buildings, and what healthier building practices are in use now and in the future. Next slide, please. So the majority of what I'll be talking about is going to be focused on a SmartMarket report we brought out last year. And it was based on a survey we conducted early last year in February and March of 2016. As you can see from the slide, we had a very large respondent pool. Part of that was due to the participation by the World Green Building Council. And we landed up with almost 1,000 participants. However, what I'm going to focus on today is just the data from the U.S., but that still had a very robust 671 respondents. And those respondents include owners, architects, interior designers, and contractors. And I do want to call out that none of this research is possible without the people who partner with us. So in this case, the Canada Green Building Council and Delos, the well building people, they were the core sponsors. They were really the people who funded it enough to get everything going. We also had a lot of industry support from CBRE, Dewberry, USGBC, Armstrong, and the Regenerative Network. But I do want to also point out, it's a little hard to see on this slide, that we had some really important research partners who distributed the survey to their members. And that included the American Institute of Architects, ASID, the American Society of Interior Designers, an owner organization called NAREM, and as I already mentioned, the World Green Building Council. Next slide, please. So what I want to look at first is what is a healthier building. And if you could take it to the next slide. So one of the things we wanted to make sure of when we started this research was that we gave the participants in the study a chance to really respond to the same definition of health. And rather than reinvent the wheel, we decided to go with the World Health Organization's definition of health. And I do want to cover that because it is very important. It's a complete state of physical, mental, and social health and well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And why is that important? For two reasons. One is that a lot of focus on health in buildings specifically tends to be about not doing harm. And as you can see, this is about promoting well-being. So it's a really important distinction. The other assumption that people often make is that when we're speaking about health, we're speaking just about physical health. But that concept about mental and social health is also equally important. So we wanted to make sure all of our participants up front were thinking of all of this when they went forward. Next slide. Now, one of the things we wanted to determine was how much of a priority is health among all our survey participants, which again are owners, architects, interior designers, and contractors. So we took a series of factors that would influence people's decisions during the design and construction process, and we just listed health as one of them. They hadn't gone far enough in the survey to really know it was about health yet. And we asked them to rate its influence on a scale of 1 to 5 on their design and construction decisions. All of the percentages you see on this slide are those who rated it a 4 or a 5, so very influential on their decisions. And I just want to quickly point out that you can see that architects and interior designers are already strongly influenced by health. Over 70% of architects, over 80% of interior designers really consider this a strongly influential factor. When it comes to owners, the picture is a little bit more complicated. 2/3 say they're influenced by health, and that is a key thing to walk away with here. But it isn't exactly their highest priority. We see other things such as design and construction cost savings and operating cost savings with a lot more owners saying that these factors are influential. And when it comes time to make decisions about what stays and what goes in a project, knowing what influences an owner can be critical. So that's why that is important. However, even though there is, it does rank 5th, you can see that it's relatively close to the top factors that are above it. On the other hand, when it comes to the contractors, while it ranks 4th among them, there's a huge 30 percentage point gap between the things that are most influential and and occupant health and well-being. So in some ways, that is a community that really is particularly challenged when it comes to this message. Next slide. So we are going to focus a little bit on owners. Why do they care about healthier buildings? Because of course, if they care, that will move this along. And we also want to look at what interests them most. Next slide. So a lot of assumptions that people had, and that we had, quite frankly, going into this study, is that the key thing owners want from healthier buildings is improved productivity. That's supposed to be the holy grail, right? If we can prove that, then we really have a business case. But when we asked owners who were making healthier building investments what the goals were that they wanted to achieve from those, you can see that the financial benefit due to greater productivity was important to just under 2/3 of them. But in fact, having happier and healthier building occupants, and more interestingly, having improved tenant-employee satisfaction with the building is the top-ranked feature, the top-ranked goal that they wanted to do. More of them selected that than anything else other than that happier and healthy building occupants. Next slide. And what's exciting about this is that they can actually measure this right now. There are great survey tools out there that can actually link the performance of the building to the performance to employee satisfaction. And we found out which owners were actually surveying on employee satisfaction, were actually measuring it. Then we asked those owners to say, when they've made healthier building investments, what impact that's had on employee satisfaction. So when you look at this pie, the green is a high level of improvement in employee satisfaction. The yellow is a medium level. So you can see over half already say, hey, this has got a pretty big impact. Now, that bright blue to the left top side of the pie, that 26%, that is the group that don't know. Now, if you actually pull their responses out of it, you can see that over 3/4 of those who remain are seeing at least a medium level of improvement or higher. Next slide. We did also ask them about other things that would impact their business case for health, for making investments in health. And we can see that the market is still trying to determine the financial impacts of those. When you look at these 3 factors, leasing buildings more quickly, the impact on asset value, and charging a premium rent, we can see that the majority of respondents, for the most part, just aren't sure what kind of impact their healthier buildings investments are having right now. But if you do, again, just focus on taking out that blue wedge and just focus on the yellow and the orange and see what percentage of the yellow is of what remains, you can see that one thing that they're very strongly enthusiastic about is that healthier buildings appear to help buildings lease more quickly. And a little bit over half also find that they're seeing a positive impact on asset value. We see less of a positive impact, though. That most do not feel that they get to charge a premium rent to this point initially. Next slide. So what are the healthier building features that interest owners? Now, for this part of the study, we did a really interesting thing. We asked owners, we gave owners a list of features and said, which of these are you interested in? But we gave the same list to the architects, interior designers, and contractors. And we said, which of these do you think your clients are interested in? So the percentages are just those that checked, yes, we think we are interested in this, or our clients are interested in this. So owners are by far the most interested in enhanced ventilation. And, well over half, 61%, say that this is something that really interests them. And when we compare that to those who think their clients are interested, you can see that the industry significantly underestimates their client interest in this area. Same thing holds true for layout encouraging physical design. Nearly half, 40% of the owners say, yes, we are interested in this, but most architects, interior designers, and contractors don't believe their clients are that interested. And I want you to remember this one, too, because this idea of encouraging physical activity in the building appears to be a really important emerging trend, and we'll see some other data towards that. But finally, we also see that owners are interested in transparency of product information. It is only 30%, but for owners to even care about that, I thought was a very, very striking finding. And for a little bit more information on transparency, I want to hand this back over to Diana. Next slide.
Thank you, Donna. So Donna has shown you that building owners care about several healthy building features, including ventilation and encouraging physical activity. But let's take a minute to talk about that third item she mentioned, product transparency. What is it, and how do building owners and specifiers learn what they want to know about products? Transparency means, next slide, please. Transparency means telling users and specifiers everything they need to know about a product. And this starts with the chemicals that the product contains when it's in use, the hazards and risks of those chemicals, and what the known safety and health implications are of the ingredients. And finally, more comprehensively, the full impact on the environment of manufacturing, using, and disposing of the products. The conversation actually starts with transparency. If the ingredients of a product or its impact are a mystery, how can a specifier or user make any decisions on what products to put into a building? And when a user knows what's in the product and its impact, then he or she can ask for products with less harmful ingredients or manufacturing processes, and the manufacturer can respond. But none of these things are possible without transparency. Next slide, please. So how do we communicate these important pieces of information that building owners say they are interested in and they do value? If every manufacturer chose their own method, there wouldn't be any consistency for the user. So in the industry, we have a few tools that we settled on for communication, and now I show them here, and I'll go through each. I should say the first is the SDS, the safety data sheet, and this is a legally required document for worker safety, but it doesn't really have much information that would allow a user to understand what goes into a building. Some of the tools that are used for voluntary disclosure are shown here. As I go through the tools, you're going to notice that some of them address healthy buildings directly by disclosing the product ingredients, while others start to consider the effect on the environment of the product and its manufacturing. And it turns out there's a lot of common ground between caring about the healthiness of a building and its occupants and caring about the impact of building products and practices on the environment. Next slide. So first, let's talk about a health product declaration. This is a voluntary document for product manufacturers to detail the known health impacts of their products to provide transparency to users. HPDs are created according to an open consensus-based standard maintained by the HPD Collaborative. Manufacturers disclose the ingredients in a product at various levels, from the lowest level, which is just per the safety data sheet, to the ideal full disclosure of ingredients measured at 100 parts per million. The HPD can be used for compliance to various green building standards that I'll describe later. I'd like to note here that the HPD doesn't tell the user what's in the product, in other words, the risk. It doesn't say anything about whether the building occupants will be exposed to those ingredients. Risk is not identical to hazard. It's equal to the potential for hazard. So a specifier has to understand the in-use location of products and whether occupants will be exposed to them. Next slide. The Declare label is also a chemical disclosure tool maintained by the Living Building Challenge. It evaluates ingredients against the chemical red list and against the EPA's list of chemicals of concern. A red list is a list of chemicals that have been identified as bad actors, either for people or for the environment. The Declare label also discloses any disposal options, such as recyclability. From this, you can see that Declare goes beyond health product declarations to begin evaluating not only the health of the building environment for building occupants, but also the effect of the product's manufacture and disposal on the environment. There are 3 levels of Declare label. Declared is the most basic level, meaning that the manufacturer has disclosed what's in the product, but it still may contain some red list chemicals. Even this basic level is valuable because it promotes transparency in our industry. And as I said, it starts the conversation between manufacturers and users. Next slide. Now let's talk about some disclosure tools that go beyond product ingredients to look at the impact of the product on the environment. Not strictly a feature of healthy buildings, but as I've said, there's considerable overlap between groups and individuals who consider the health of the building and those who consider the impact on the environment. A life cycle assessment is a tool that's based on measurable attributes to calculate the net impact on the environment. The life cycle assessment may consider a whole building, or for the purpose of today's talk, an individual product. And it takes a cradle-to-gate approach, which means it considers the impact on the environment of the entire product's life cycle, including raw material extraction, or the cradle part, to disposal at the end of life, or the grave part. Next slide, please. The LCA, or Life Cycle Assessment, can be used to generate the final disclosure tool I'll talk about today, the Environmental Product Declaration, or EPD. The EPD is used to report effects on the environment, such as contribution to global warming or acid rain, among the others shown here. A user may also like to know the total energy that was used to create, ship, and install the product, how much waste was generated, and increasingly users are interested in how much water was consumed. These are all disclosed for a product that has an EPD. Next slide. So we've seen some of the tools that are available to report on products. From the research Donna has conducted, we know that the majority of architects, contractors, and owners say they're influenced to at least a medium degree by product labeling in our industry. This means that the availability of product labeling matters to them when making decisions. Next slide. To summarize the transparency section, a healthy building starts with transparency. Some available tools are health product declarations, declared labels, and an LCA used to generate the EPD, or Environmental Product Declaration. Products that have all these documents are transparent and meet customers' desires to know what is going into their building. And now Donna will tell you what may drive the industry in the future.
Okay, and we can just move on to the next slide after this one. So we asked the participants, again, the owners, architects, interior designers, and contractors, what the top drivers were that they considered to be most important for increasing the consideration of health during design and construction. Now, you can see for the overall survey, greater public awareness of the health impacts of buildings turned out to be the top driver. But what's interesting is that is largely because the largest number of participants in the study were architects and and interior designers, and this was most important to them. So, that's what drove it to the overall top, but it really is interesting that what architects and interior designers are looking for is the public to drive the demand for this, to be aware of it, the way they've become aware of sustainability. When you look at what owners think will drive them, will drive greater consideration by them the most, they think it will be more research on designing construction approaches that can positively impact health. They're looking for information on what they can do, how they can make effective changes. And contractors are looking for ways to make this a less expensive process. They're looking for government incentives to directly financially encourage the market. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to doing that industry study, we also wanted to look at what some potential partners for promoting healthier buildings in the industry could be. And in a previous study, we had looked at HR professionals at major corporations, but in this study, we focused on public health professionals. And we surveyed them, and there were some interesting findings that do suggest that they are, in fact, really strong potential partners in this area. Almost all of them, 98%, said their institutions, either public or private, are conducting research on the health impacts of buildings. So there should be a lot more information available in the next few years. 65% say that they already see government policies in place that require companies to avoid using hazardous materials in buildings. So again, the standard up till now has been doing no harm, and we can see that 2/3 think that they see regulations in place about that. But nearly half say that they see government policies being considered, things that haven't been enacted yet but are definitely moving their way through the process, for incentives for design that encourage physical activity. So again, there's that side of regulation and government driving increased physical activity. Next slide, please. And, in addition to looking at what can push the industry forward, we do want to also see, well, what's holding it back from doing greater investments? What do they see as the biggest obstacles? And as you can see, there's no question that budget concerns and limitations are by far selected by most as the biggest obstacle. And this is very similar to what we saw in the green building movement when it was still in the earlier stages in 2006, 2007, when we were doing research back then, that this idea about first cost budget limitations was a severe problem, but that as the green building movement was able to make the business case for green, that this, while still always a consideration, went significantly down. And we do think that as more data becomes clear on health, that we might see the same pattern emerge again. Next slide. And in fact, I also want to challenge this idea that a healthier building is necessarily a high-end or very, very expensive building. And we had a great case study in the report that demonstrated this. Out in Minnesota, there was a group that wanted to do a project that was more than 50% affordable housing units. And they needed to keep the construction cost to within $154 per square foot for this building. But they wanted to see how far they could take it, not just in LEED, but using the Living Building Challenge. And I know that Diana is going to give you more information on that in a little bit. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Living Building Challenge, just give it a few minutes and you'll get a lot more information. But they wanted to see how far they could push it. And they were able to do some really interesting things with green. But they also put this big emphasis on health because they thought for an affordable housing project, making the building healthier would be a big factor in what they would consider a successful building. So, of course, that meant daylighting. That also meant adding a dedicated outdoor air system without hurting their energy use intensity figures. But the most interesting thing they did on this is that they were able to incorporate a lot of healthier building materials, probably quite frequently using the standards Diana has already talked about, but do so, but without increasing the construction cost by very much, by only 1% or less. did they increase the construction cost, but they used things like a bio-based tile to eliminate 11.2 tons of toxins from the building. And, they were able to keep their VOC levels remarkably low. And this is really interesting. And one of the main factors that they attribute to their success in doing this is that when it came time for the contractors to actually buy and install the materials, if they wanted to make any substitutions, they had to demonstrate that the material that they were substituting, or the piece of equipment that they were substituting, performed just as well in terms of its health impacts as the material that was originally spec'd. And so not only did they land up with, materials that really did meet their original vision, but they also apparently landed up with a great deal more documentation on what actually went into this building than they've ever had on any other building that they've done. So it was a really interesting model. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and we already just touched on them a little bit there, but let's look at the healthier building practices that are in use now and in the future. Next slide. So what's being used most widely? Certainly better daylighting and lighting exposure. This is used by 70% or more, and it's not particularly surprising. First of all, a lot of green building standards do call for a specific amount of daylighting, and this has been true for many, many years. So, it's become a standard practice when you're thinking about a green building to think in those terms. In addition to that, if you're looking at commercial real estate, better lighting just makes the building easier to rent. So, it has its own financial appeal beyond its health benefits. However, it is interesting to look at what was used by 60% or more, and that includes products that enhance thermal comfort and spaces that enhance social interactions. And this notion of social interactions is something we've really seen emerging in the last few years as an important trend in this space. And I wonder if we had conducted this back in, say, 2012, if that would have been used quite as frequently. Then finally, a few things that were used by more than half include enhanced air quality, products enhancing acoustical comfort, excluding materials of concern, occupant controls, and spaces that enhance tenant mood. So again, you don't just have things that are physical, like air quality. You have things that help with social and mental well-being as well. Next slide. Now, in addition to what they're using now, we were really curious, since this is an emerging movement, to look at what do they think they'll be using in the next 5 years. And you can see for the most part, most of them think that they'll be using the same exact things that they're using now. So just using more of it. And you can see that everything within those red boxes I just mentioned on the previous slide. Next slide. However, there were two things that emerged that 50% or more did say that they would be using in the next 5 years that are currently not very widely used right now. One is that same opportunities for physical activity that I've told you about. Again, this is another piece of data that suggests that this is an emerging trend. This is something that the industry is paying more and more attention to. But in addition to that, we see biophilic design principles. And I think the mental aspects and the emotional aspects of health really are influencing the importance of this particular feature. That and an increasing amount of data that demonstrates the power of biophilia and proper use of biophilic design. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand it back over to Diana, who's going to go through some of the building design standards for us.
Thank you, Donna. So now that we've seen some of the healthy building priorities that are existing and coming about in the future, you might be asking, how do we go about incorporating these into buildings? So fortunately, there's help for that in the form of some great building design standards, green building standards and others, some of which have been under development for many years. Next slide, please. The most common green building standards that are used in North America are shown here. They each have a slightly different focus, but they also have a lot in common. They look not just at building and occupant health, but also energy efficiency, global warming, and impacts on the environment. And these can be due to building renovation or construction, as well as the manufacture of the products that go into the building. First, ASHRAE 189.1, which is the standard for high-performance green buildings. This standard was designed to be incorporated into building codes, and so it's written so as to be code enforceable. LEED may be the most well-known green building standard. It's voluntary, and it uses a credit-based rating system. LEED is primarily concerned about increasing energy efficiency and decreasing global warming. LEED has been described as striving to reduce damage, while the Living Building Challenge, shown here next, is even more ambitious. It strives to actually repair damage to the environment and health through greener building practices. And finally, we have the WELL Building Standard, which is a relatively new standard that addresses the health and well-being of buildings' occupants as its primary aim. First, let's talk about ASHRAE 189.1. I've highlighted here the elements of the standard that touch directly on building and occupant health. The main categories for this standard are site sustainability, water use, energy efficiency, indoor environmental quality, and the building's impact on atmosphere, materials, and resources. Contained within site sustainability, you can find guidance on site selection and how to encourage bike transportation. And those are features that can contribute to healthy building occupants through encouraging physical activity, which is one of the trends that Donna touched on. Within IEQ, or indoor environmental quality, we find most of the features that directly address building health and well-being as we've defined it. In this section are requirements for building ventilation, thermal and acoustical comfort, and daylighting. It also covers emitting materials in indoor space. The final section requires the environmental product declarations I talked about earlier under transparency documents. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about LEED. Again, here I've highlighted the elements of the standard that look directly at building and occupant health. Location and transportation touch on bike enabling and encouraging walking. And LEED is very explicit about requiring product transparency in the section entitled Materials and Resources. This is where you can find credits given for having health product declarations, environmental product declarations, and the other transparency documents I talked about a little while ago. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that LEED has actually been a key driver in creating an expectation for transparency documents throughout our industry. Within IEQ, or indoor environmental quality, we again find most of the features that directly address building health and well-being as we've defined it. In this section, once again, similar to 189.1, are requirements for building ventilation, thermal and acoustical comfort, and daylighting. Next slide, please. The Living Building Challenge is attempting to raise the bar and to find the most advanced measure of sustainability in the built environment. It's also primarily focused on sustainability and energy usage, similar to the previous two, but it touches on building health even more than the LEED and ASHRAE standards. There are many mandatory provisions, and I've just shown a few here. Within materials, the Living Building Challenge looks at removing chemicals that are on the red list, referring back to the declare label I talked about earlier. Within indoor quality, the standard addresses ventilation, indoor air quality, daylighting, and acoustical and thermal comfort. This section also recommends a biophilic design, which is a trend that Donna has identified as coming in the future, people believing that it is coming in the future. And in addition, the LBC has a section that directly addresses beauty and inspiration, which can also affect occupant satisfaction and well-being. Next slide. And then finally, WELL, which is a relatively new building standard, is the only one that explicitly looks at creating a building environment that encourages the health and well-being of occupants. It uses the latest research studies on the health and well-being of people, and it focuses on a number of different aspects: air and water quality, eating habits, lighting, fitness opportunities, and in common with the other standards, indoor environmental qualities, such as acoustical and thermal comfort. And in this standard, product transparency documentation is also encouraged, and it's captured under MIND, which addresses mental and emotional health. Just one example of how the focus of this standard is different from the others is water. The other standards are concerned with preserving water as a precious resource, but the WELL standard is concerned with ensuring that drinking water is easily available and free of pollutants. And that's it for building standards. Now Donna will wrap up the webinar with additional insights into the industry.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, so, we really wanted to end by emphasizing that we know that the industry wants to know more about healthier buildings. We actually asked them about which categories they were interested in finding out more information on. And there's a few things, interesting things that emerged. One is that the degree to which owners are really interested in finding out more, again, is one of the more striking elements of the study. You can see that a very high percentage of owners, along with a very high percentage of architects and interior designers, want to know about ways to measure the impact of health. They want to understand what is going on, how their buildings are actually impacting health, what these investments, how they're paying off in terms of their occupants so that the occupants can be more satisfied and happier. They are very concerned about materials, toxins, chemicals of concern, and about transparency about building materials, which we've already touched on quite a bit. That notion that transparency can really help avoid the kind of toxins, I think Diana really laid out quite brilliantly. And of course, it's not surprising that architects and interior designers are the most interested in this, but you can see that even contractors are pretty highly concerned about the question of toxins and chemicals of concern. I think perhaps, though, one of the most surprising ones is that just simple, straightforward health benefits performs so highly across all four groups that half or more, for the most cases, or almost half in the case of contractors, really just want to know the basic health benefits. Again, it goes to the need for more education in the industry on this topic. And, we have reinforcement again that strategies that promote physical activity is definitely an emerging area of interest. So all in all, we do see the industry expressing interest. We see owner-client interest in particular that can help drive the rest, but we also see the need for a strong business case that will carry it through. Kim, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Donna. So I'd just like to take a couple minutes to go over some additional free resources that we offer that you can use to help navigate things like healthier building design or the materials that you specify. So the first resource I'd like to discuss is the blog that we offer. Now, we both write and curate content for our blog, so this means that we not only rely on our technical experts at JM to do this, but we also find information from technical experts throughout the industry, so you're getting a full spectrum of information that doesn't just come from JM. Now, these blogs hit on targeted technical information like the latest news in the industry and scientific details that are critical to successful installation, system design, and even operations. But we strive to make this content as rich and relevant as possible so that it can better serve you in the information that you need. Now, the second resource we have is our engineers portal. And this was designed specifically with engineers in mind. It's currently available for both our mechanical and HVAC products, and it's a resource where you have access to the specification data for all of our products in one location. So we built this specifically so that you can easily do a side-by-side comparison of thermal values, NRC ratings, product densities, etc. And you can also find access to our EPDs directly from this page for a number of our different products. And finally is our exclusive content portal. Now, as we know, you can't always attend the live webinars that you sign up for, so we actually record each of our webinars and post them on the exclusive content portal of our website. So this is basically a library of our recorded webinars, videos, and white papers and other technical documentation that we have available to you to use as a resource. So if you miss a webinar or if you're looking for additional detailed information on a specific topic, this is actually a great resource that you can use where you can actually really dive into the details. So for everybody who attended the webinar today, you're actually going to get a certificate of completion following this webinar, and this will be sent directly to you by Friday. So with that, let's go ahead and start taking some questions. Again, as Diana said there at the beginning, if you have any questions you'd like to submit, you can submit them via the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. So the first question we have is for Diana, and it basically reads, how can I obtain the transparency documents from manufacturers?
Thank you, Kim. So it's very easy to do. You just contact the manufacturer through their technical services, and they'll be glad to supply you any documentation that they have. There's also some online resources available from UL Environment, as well as a couple of others. But I would urge you to ask your manufacturer for these transparency documents, and if they don't have one, that may encourage them to produce them.
Excellent. So the next question is also for you, Diana, and that is, how can I get the building standards like LEED?
So each of those building standards that I've discussed is available from the organization that maintains them. A couple of them are free, like the Living Building Challenge, but we would be glad to send you a set of links so that you can easily obtain them.
Excellent. The next question here is for Donna, and that's, what's the most important finding you had from U.S. owners?
Well, you know, it's interesting because in addition to the survey results that I talked about, which was our quantitative survey, we also did a qualitative study that is also featured in the SmartMarket report. And I mean, I can't go through all the findings here, but one thing really strongly emerged from that discussion, which is that, you know, we did that qualitative. We did a series of in-depth interviews with owners who are a little bit ahead of the curve, who are really committing their resources to build healthier buildings. And they did confirm a lot of the findings. For instance, they confirmed you're not going to get higher rents. Most of them were pretty confident that they were getting asset values. Most of them were pretty confident that they were distinguishing themselves in what's already a pretty tight field. But the most important thing, I think, that came out of it was the reinforcement that for them, productivity wasn't the holy grail. They reported to me that it was difficult to actually, even with the good studies that are out there, and there's some really interesting studies out there now that do demonstrate that people working in healthier buildings are much more productive. But for individual companies, it's very hard to take that academic finding and translate it in a dollars and cents way into their business plans. But companies really do care about occupant experience, whether it's the occupants are their tenants or whether the occupants are their employees. Being able to demonstrate that they are satisfying and improving that occupant experience has great value to building owners. And that appears right now to be the engine that's driving green building. Now, perhaps down the line, if we're able to get to the holy grail of productivity, that would be great. But, you know, if you're out there and you're trying to think about how to make the case to your owner, it'd be better to go in with something that they can capitalize on immediately.
Excellent, thank you. So actually the next one is also a follow-up to that, and is it basically, are you stating that there are a lot of healthier buildings out there already?
That is a really good question because I don't want there to be any confusion about that. Now, we don't have any actual figures, but we know that this is just an emerging area. Even the owners that we found who are really leading the charge on this tended to have one or two buildings that got to the point where they could consider WELL certification. You know, this is definitely something that a lot of people are looking at, but not a lot of people are doing yet, which is why we paid so much attention to both the goals that the owners have and their level of interest, because we wanted to find out, is this something that's got legs in the industry? And it really, the study strongly demonstrates that it is, but it is definitely still an emerging area. It is not something that is as well established. And one thing that's really interesting is that, and you know, this, we'll see how this plays out in the long run, but a lot of the findings, and I pointed to this at one point during my talk, a lot of the findings do suggest that this is very much a mirror of what was happening in the early green building movement, that there was engagement by a lot of forward-leading professionals, that there was the creation of a standard that allowed people to sort of understand and come up with strategies, whether they decided to go for certification or not. And all of this kind of activity and interest really does seem to mirror that. Now, again, what finally landed up driving the green building movement, according to our data at least, according to all the studies that we've conducted, they certainly suggest that what drove the green building movement was the business case. The business case that owners were finally able to make, and it is going to be critical if we're going to see healthier buildings expand for this same kind of business case to be able to be made.
Excellent, thank you. And so one more question that we have here is that it's for you, Diana, and that is, how do I get started in healthier building design?
Thank you, Kim. I'd start with basic transparency and ventilation. You know, it can be pretty daunting paperwork-wise and others to try to build a building to living building challenge or LEED at first. But if you start with requesting transparency documents and making sure that a building is ventilated properly, it should take us down the path to a healthier building, even with those initial changes. So that's where I would start.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that wraps up all the questions we've actually had for today. Now,
hey,
we do
Tim, excuse me, I see a question about whether presentations will be available.
Yeah, I was actually just about to address that. It's a question we get very often. So what we do is we record these presentations and we will post them online so that you can have the presentation and its full context available to you, as well as anybody you might like to forward a link to or you think it might be useful information for. We will send out that link to everybody who signed up as soon as it is available online. So now also, as Diana mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today, you will receive a survey following this webinar. Now, we would appreciate it if you took a little time and just offered your feedback for us today. That really helps us improve these webinars and make them more useful to people like you. Additionally, if there were any questions that you weren't able to ask or that you might have after the presentation comes to a close, you can certainly submit those via the survey as well, and we will reach out to you directly via email. So please keep an eye on your inboxes also for the certificate of completion. That'll come straight to you, and again, by Friday. Now, I believe that wraps it up. Thank you very much for attending today. Yeah, we hope you found this information useful and relevant, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly or via the survey, and we hope you take care and enjoy the rest of your week.